Good morning. This is the Vermont House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Thursday, the 26th, and in our morning session, we're going to be getting an overview and doing a little bit of a deeper dive into a conversation about how Vermont elections work in preparation for some of the legislation we'll be doing on elections policies over the next few weeks. So Will Senning from the Elections Division Secretary of State's office is here, and he's going to be leading this conversation. And Will, I think we had talked about, but I hadn't had a chance to talk to Carol Dawes, that you might, there's clerk-related stuff, defer to her, so I'll let you kind of drive, and we want to bring Carol in for her clerk perspective. That'd be great.
Sure. Are you ready?
We're ready to go. It's all you. Thank you so much.
Then, for the record, Will Senning, Director of Elections at the Secretary of State's office. And Mr. Chair asked me to come in this morning, and as he said, provide a even more detailed review. You know, I came in a week or two ago and sort of gave the broad stroke of the role of our office in election administration, but we're going to go a little deeper this morning. The chair referred to it as a 201 in election administration in Vermont. So feel free, I think, to ask questions throughout, and or I can run through the notes I've got here. We can do a good questions session at the end, a little of both. I'll try to leave plenty of time for that because I think that's as important as anything else. And also, as the chair said, leave time for Carol to fill in any gaps that I left when I'm done, and or jump in anytime, Carol, too, if you feel like it's appropriate at the moment. So, and I appreciated the request, because I think the idea is to set the plate for, if we do end up talking about some changes to the election law, to kind of set the baseline where we're at before any of those changes are made. So with that, I'll get started. And I did provide a broad outline that I'm going to be working from for the committee, if you want to follow along as I go. Really, there are two basic types of elections that take place in Vermont, right? What I call the statewide elections, which, as I note here, occur in all of the towns and cities across Vermont on the same date. That's driven by the fact that there are federal offices on the ballot for those elections. What that also means is that those elections implicate, where it's applicable, federal law in cases that apply to those elections, where it may not to your other local elections. Which that brings us to the second really basic type of elections in Vermont. You get your statewide elections, which are, we'll get to the details, but of course the presidential primary every 4 years in March, the first Tuesday in March. It's aligned with the annual meeting days. The August statewide primary, which occurs every 2 years. That's the second Tuesday in August. And the November general election, which is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November every 2 years. As I mentioned, what ties those together is that a federal office appears on those ballots every time, which is the U.S. House race. Our U.S. House rep is elected every 2 years. And so that means that every 2 years there's a federal office on those ballots. Then, of course, our two senators are elected every 6 years. And so I think that equates to them being on the ballot 2 out of 3 of those cycles. So we do come up against a cycle every once in a while where the U.S. Senate is not on the ballot, but the U.S. rep is. And then, of course, every 4 years you've got the presidential election going on also. Local meetings, local elections, and that's, you just heard me do it. You'll hear those two terms used interchangeably and can sometimes confuse people and, you know, blur the lines sometimes with the open meeting law when you're referring to meetings. Comes from the terms of our being the annual meeting, which is really the annual election in each of these municipalities. And then we also often hear local elections throughout the year referred to as special meetings. I try and refer to them as special elections just for clarity, because then you also have special meetings of public bodies, for instance, that are not the same thing as these special elections that pop up. The special elections at the local level sort of can come about in a number of ways. they can be, the hand can be forced of the local legislative body via a petition circulated by voters. Generally, you need 5% of the registered voters in a municipality to sign a petition to ask for a certain question to be voted on. There's then a whole body of case law. It's really not in statute, but in case law that determines which of those questions that can be petitioned the local legislative body is required to hold an election for or not. I don't like to try and summarize lines of case law off the top of my head, but in this case, the easiest sort of simple way to think about that, I think if I could summarize it, is that you can force a vote on issues that are, number one, within the town's authority to dictate. So what that would exclude, for instance, is those kind of petitions that are, throw the president in jail because he did X, Y, Z. Those can be denied even if you get more than 5% of your registered voters. Or say clerk and all other local officials have to wear purple to the office every day. That's not necessarily town business that you need to force a vote on. So there's some limits, right, to what you can ask for an election for. On the other end of that spectrum, there are a number of cases throughout the statute where voters are specifically empowered to make a decision. If a petition is submitted to hold a vote on one of those, you really have to. An example of that is increasing the size of the select board from 3 to 5 members, moving the date of the annual meeting, et cetera. There are places in the statute, wherever the statute, if you're reading through it, says when a town so votes, that's empowering the voters to make that decision, and you can petition that kind of question. There are no, that makes me think, other subject matter, right, that gets voted on at local elections. There are no recall provisions. So the subject of a petition cannot be to remove someone from office at the local level. And generally, the election of the officers takes place at the annual meeting and the various boards and bodies that serve a town. So those are your local elections generally. When a clerk receives a petition, figures out that it has the right number of signatures on it, submits it to the select board. Carol, gosh, I don't have it right in my notes, but the election has to be held, I believe, within 60 days of receipt of the petition. I'm getting the thumbs up. That allows for the board to take, 30 days to actually post the warning, because the warnings for local elections have to occur 30 days before those. So those are your two basic types of elections. Then the chair asked me to kind of speak to the roles our office plays in those elections and the roles the clerks play. I'm going to go into more detail, of course, about our office. I can summarize what I see as the clerk's roles in those, and then let Carol fill in the gaps that I may leave. So for each of the two types of elections, I'll go through the roles. For the statewide elections, that's, of course, the primary focus of my office. And what is the Secretary of State and Elections Division responsible for? The first thing, and I like to say to the clerks when we do trainings for them, that this is sort of the part of election administration that they deal with year round on a day-to-day basis, isn't really tied to the calendar of a specific election, and that's their checklist, their voter checklist. So our office is responsible for sort of oversight, maintenance, and clerk guidance for all aspects of managing the statewide voter checklist. I say here, including the My Voter page, which is a more recent tool we've put in place with our current election management system, which is a real resource for voters around Vermont. I hope that the committee has checked out their own My Voter pages. You log in with your own personal identifying information and can get a whole wealth of information about upcoming elections, the ability to request an absentee ballot, make changes to your voter registration data, track the progress of that ballot when you receive it and send it back. Find your polling place locations, contact your clerks, et cetera, see your sample ballots. The existence of that statewide checklist really quickly, and the structure where our office houses it and is sort of at the top, but it is really the substance, the voters in the checklist are really managed by the individual town clerks. That's driven by the National Voter Registration Act. It was passed back in the mid-90s, 93 or 94, and required every state to establish a statewide voter checklist. Before that time, checklists were not necessarily centrally located or, there wasn't a single one in a given state. And that's been the case ever since the implementation of the MVRA. So helping the clerks throughout the year with management of the voter checklist, of course, that's become ever more important these days as we're doing more ballot mailings to keep both the voters up to date on the checklist. So keeping up with people who may leave or may pass away. And also keeping the addresses, the mailing addresses as up to date as possible. When we built the current statewide checklist, it was a huge data import, of course, from the town clerk's offices into the new statewide checklist. And so the level of completeness of voter records across the board varies pretty widely. Particularly that there's less data and there's sometimes less complete voter records for those older ones that have existed way in the past and have been brought into the system. As we register new voters these days, we collect a more complete body of information.
Could you, while you're on this topic, talk a little bit about what the what is the voter checklist a list of? So what does it mean to be a voter that's an active registered voter that's on each of the clerk's checklists? And if somebody does move away, how do they get off of that list?
It's a good question. Really, the voter checklist is all registered voters in a given town. They're currently registered. When you are purged, really removed from the checklist, you don't appear on it anymore. There is in the back end, records of records that have been purged. But the checklist that's in use at any given moment has both what we refer to as active voters and in Vermont, what we refer to as challenged voters. And we're always really clear that a challenged voter is still a registered voter and still eligible to vote in any election. They have to take one step before they're able to then participate if they're in that challenged status. That step being confirming that they still live in the town. How do they get in that challenged status? That brings me back to the MVRA, and it's a good question to make clear because it does drive a lot of policy. The MVRA also addressed the situation of bringing a common approach to how you maintain your checklist in the case of voters who move out of town. It's fairly easy, right, when somebody dies to know to remove them, or if somebody tells you I'm leaving town to remove them from the checklist. Proactively tell the clerk. And this is the case across the country, right? People moving in and out of jurisdictions. So what the MVRA essentially said, try to be quick, is that in those cases, if you have reason to believe that a voter's moved out of town, you have to send them a notice, is what it's referred to under the MVRA. You send that notice to the last known address that you have on file for the voter, and then it essentially asks the voter to confirm whether they've moved out of town or whether they're still there. You get a response to that notice. If they say I've moved out, you can take them off. If they say I'm still there, when the notice is sent, that's what I should say. When you send that notice to a voter you have reason to believe has moved, that's when they move into challenged status. We call it a challenge letter here in Vermont. It's referred to in different ways across the country, but that's where that challenge status came to be in the challenge letter. We're challenging the fact that you still live here. I almost prefer the term notice, but the term challenged was baked into stone before I got here.
I think we heard that there's also there's a little bit of distaste for that word amongst the Clerks and Treasurers Association, if I remember.
It may well be.
Carol says nothing, and so
challenged by the word.
okay, yeah,
I agree.
So one of the things that came up in a bill introduction that we had early on was the number of mail ballots during the general election that came back to clerks as undeliverable.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you have an opinion on whether or not that might be reason enough to issue a challenge letter in the next cycle.
It certainly could be. The way the guidance I give to clerks is the way I would approach it if I were a clerk is to use that as a starting point. And I was gonna get to this.
Don't let me get ahead.
No, that's okay. That's okay. As a starting point for when you present the list of names that you think should be challenged or noticed to your BCA, your Board of Civil Authority, which is really the entity that makes this decision in the first place. To complete the process under the MVRA, you send the notice. If you get response, like I said, either remove or don't remove based on the response. What's the much more common thing is you don't hear back from these people at all. And if you don't get a response to those notice-challenge letters, the law says, the MVRA says, and talk about a frustration point for clerks, but there's policy behind it, of course, is that you have to wait 2 general election cycles where the person does not come to vote and does not otherwise respond to that notice before they can then be purged off of your list. And so that's always the process. It's notice, 2 general elections without a response, and then you can purge them. If that person does show up to an election to vote, that's when you need to ask them essentially for the response to the notice letter. That's what the affirmation of domicile affidavit that the clerks have at the polls is. It's basically their opportunity to respond. So maybe you didn't get the letter or you lost it, but you come to vote. Oh yeah, of course I still live here. Here's my signed response. That you both allow them to vote at that point. That's why we say they're still qualified registered voters, even when they're in that status. And then of course you go back to your office, after the election and you move them back into an active status because you've gotten a response from them at the election. It also requires, and this goes to your question and where I wanted to note it, that once every 2 years in the off year, the Board of Civil Authority has to meet and review the checklist name by name and make decisions about who needs to be sent a challenge letter, a notice. And so that happens in the September of the off year in the election cycle. So last September, all the boards, or prior to that, the reporting of that activity having taken place comes to our office in September. So that really drives the ability of clerks to do list maintenance on a certain schedule, right? There's a lot of cases where the clerks will tell me they know for a fact that this person is gone, but they can't get a response to a notice letter. And so they're waiting 2 general election cycles before they can be purged and removed from the checklist. I always remind the clerks at this point, right? Because at this day and age, we have a lot more modes of communication. So for instance, if you have an email for these people, shoot them an email and say, send me a 1-line email back that says, you're right, I've moved out of town. And that's written notice that they can be removed from the checklist. So we try and work together with the clerks in a lot of ways to figure out other ways to reach these voters and get responses when they believe they've moved out of town.
Representative Hooper and then
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You just hit on my question, I guess. If the trigger for sending the challenge letter is that the ballot came back, then we're basically going down the same road with the letter. Unless you think that the federal employees are doing an extra special job of making sure that ballots particularly meet the criteria for name on the box and all that stuff. And secondly, do you get a lot of ballots back from post office boxes as opposed to street addresses?
I think I followed you. And the way I would put it is the clerks get undeliverable ballots back for a wide variety of reasons. Errors in the address as it's entered in the voter record are probably the primary reason.
Pulling the information for the challenge letter out of some sort of database unless you're using email or something.
No, correct. And that's why I think it's a legitimate basis to start from, if not be the only basis when you get an undeliverable ballot back for a certain person on your checklist. I always try and remind people and the clerks that, the notice letter shouldn't be seen as any kind of affront to somebody. So if you have any indication that there's a reason to send one, why not go ahead and do it and at least, start the clock at that point and see if you can get a reply.
And so my question is kind of like in the same vein. So when the BCAs are reviewing rolls, could they or would they save the returned ballots that were undeliverable to cross-reference?
Yes.
Okay, so that's totally fine as a function?
Yes.
Okay.
So my question is sort of the crux of what we were talking about during Representative Labor's bill introduction. When a challenge letter, the notice letter has been sent, does that mean that the voter, while they're still on the checklist, would they receive the universal vote by mail ballot in the next general election? So if, for instance, no. So it seems to me that since we're in the early first couple of election cycles with universal vote by mail, that there've been, especially in St. Albans City, for instance, you know, we have a lot of folks who move in, get registered, then move out. We have a lot of renters for Vermont. So the clerk gets a number of returned ballots, can then send out after the election gets into that next cycle, BCA approves, can send out notice to everyone who had a bounce back that hasn't been sort of, there isn't some other kind of reason. That those people, once that letter's been sent, even though they're still on the checklist, they could still show up and vote, or they could request a ballot, they're still registered voters. They won't automatically be sent a ballot the next time if there's that letter and they're in that challenge status.
Correct.
Okay.
That's why we were really careful to word that the mailing will go only to the active registered voters.
Great.
If you'd left out the word active and just said registered voters, it would have gone to the challenge voters also.
So the missing step in these first couple, I think, is that we haven't had a cycle where we, in our city anyway, I think, where we've had, you know, a couple of different clerks, and for various different reasons, especially being the pandemic and how elections administration was so fraught, and changing policy, where we've really done a deep dive into the checklist and sent out, you know, a real big batch of those notices. So
Yep.
I think that might be a better remedy than some of the other ones we've heard, but we need to put a pin in that. This is one of the things I really wanted to cover this morning.
Great.
Thank you.
Should we get to the second bullet? Joking, this is perfect. I hoped would occur.
Yeah, 202. Yeah, right.
Sort of the primary responsibility of our office for, you know, direct administration of these elections is creation of the ballots for the statewide elections. And a lot of the rest of the calendar and processes all lead up to just getting a correct general election ballot created. So that includes receipt of the candidate filings from all of you, from the House up, from the Rep, Senate, and county clerks, which leads to the creation. We have approximately 275 ballot styles in Vermont. And ballot styles just mean a distinct combination of candidates, right? So you all understand that everybody has the same statewide candidates on their ballot, but then as you go down, that's where all the distinctions start happening. When you get to the county candidates, right? Somebody in Windsor County has a different set of candidates on their county candidates on their ballot than Orange County. So there's one break. Senate candidates generally fall along that same break, but I think, as you all know, the Senate district lines don't exactly follow the county lines. They're supposed to follow them as closely as they can, but not in all cases. And so that creates another layer of distinction. There might be two Orange County towns that share the same county candidates, but have different Senate candidates, for instance. So there's another ballot style. And then you go down another level to you all, and of course, that's a whole other layer of distinction, right? There would be multiple different ballot styles within a county based on the House rep districts. So when that all plays out after the current redistricting, we added about 10 or so different ballot styles after this year, and we're up to about 275 of those. We also, our office, so those I've said before are filed with those clerks at those lower levels and then kind of communicated to us through our election management software. So the rep clerks, county clerks, Senate clerks enter in those names. They come up to the central database where the ballots are then parsed out based on those districts. At the same time, we directly receive in our office the petitions from all independent candidates for all levels from the House and up. And so we review the signatures on those independent candidate filings and either add or don't add them to the general election ballot. Independent candidates, well, I'm going to get to this process more, but I'll just note here, go directly to the general election ballot. They don't appear on primary ballots. Those are just your major party primary nominees. Which takes us to the next bullet. We receive and review candidate nominations from major and minor parties also. Those are, and again, I'll get into more detail on this, but some candidates go onto the primary ballot for party nominations. People can do that without the assent, whatever word you want to use, blessing of anybody in the party, right? Anybody can file a petition for the primary and to run and to get on the primary ballot for either the Democrats, the Republicans, or the Progressives. Another way for parties to nominate candidates to appear on the general election ballot is by party committee. There are different deadlines for when those committees have to submit nominations and different cases in which they can do so. The obvious ones are when somebody who's nominated by the primary, then for whatever reason can't go on the general election ballot, withdraws their candidacy or dies, are the main two, right? And then so if a candidate who wins a primary, either of those things happen, then the party committee at that level can step in and nominate a replacement to go on the general election ballot. There's also a key provision in that party nomination subchapter. The other reason by which they can make one of those nominations is failure to nominate a candidate via the primary. And so if there's no candidate on the ballot for an office in the primary for a certain party, and then nobody writes in and wins that nomination by write-in in the primary election, the party committee can just nominate a candidate to appear on the general election ballot.
We heard just a brief bill introduction that was seeking to raise the threshold of the number of write-ins you would need to get in a primary in order to achieve the major party nomination, as there being a printed name on the ballot. I believe that's 25 signatures right now in current law.
For the House, it is. The way it's written is that it's 1/2 of the number of signatures that you need to appear on the ballot. So you guys need 50 signatures. You need 25 write-ins in the election.
I mean to put you on the spot at all, but is there any historical reason why it was 1/2? It seems awfully low to a lot of us, I think.
I don't know.
Okay, great.
Yep. So it plays out to 50 for Senate because they need 100 signatures and 250 for statewide because they need 500. It's all a big dance to see what names appear on the general election ballot, right? Another primary responsibility we have are procurement, ordering, design, and distribution to the town of absentee ballot envelopes for these statewide elections. That is no small task, I will tell you. The packages generally include an outgoing envelope to the voter, which will include a return envelope to send the ballot back to the clerk, what we call certificate envelope or voted ballot envelope also to put the ballot in that then goes in the return envelope. With certain amounts of required language on each of those that we coordinate with the clerks to design and develop. And then, we start well in advance of every election year asking how many each clerk needs to re-up their supply and work with our vendor to direct ship ballots and envelopes to the clerks in time for these elections. That brings me to the next bullet, which really does drive a lot of the timelines in statute right now. I referred to that, federal laws touch these statewide elections in various places. One of the most important ones, other than the MVRA, and there really is not a lot of federal law uniform across election laws in the states by design. Under the Constitution, states are really supposed to dictate the way that their elections are carried out. There are a few exceptions to that in federal law. One of the important ones is we refer to it as UOCAVA. It's the Uniformed Overseas. I'm not going to get the acronym exactly right now, but it applies to overseas civilians and active duty military members deployed either actually in the states or overseas. And after a few iterations, now requires that ballots be mailed if they have been requested by folks overseas or in the military no later than 45 days before the election. And that 45-day time frame, so we need to have the ballots prepared, produced in the hands of the clerks by that 45-day deadline, along with the envelopes they need to send them to these folks. So you could then back up from there for all of the other processes. I think Rep. Higley has been on the committee long enough to remember, I think that's what drove the moving of the primary date to the second Tuesday in August, when it used to occur on the fourth Tuesday in August. And actually before that, it used to occur in early September sometime. After this federal law was put in place that required the 45 days, it was fairly impossible to meet that deadline. Just before, I think it was the election cycle before I got here, maybe 2010. A number of towns across the state weren't able to make that deadline for various reasons, and we got sued by the Department of Justice for failing to meet it, and ended up under a consent decree with them, which has resulted in my need to report to them the Monday after every one of these 45-day deadlines about the number of requests that we had from the covered voters under this act and how many ballots went out to them. Carol will tell you that I beat the clerks over the head for about 3 weeks about this deadline coming up, and that you're going to get your ballots and that they need to go out and you need to enter that data into my system so that I can run a report on the Monday morning that's a 43rd day and report to the DOJ about it. That 45th day almost always, I think always, lands on a Saturday. And so we have the clerks get the ballots mailed out by the Friday before. And then I sometimes spend that Saturday tracking down one or two clerks that weren't able to send it out and asking if they can run into the office and mail one out. So again, that deadline drives a lot of our internal deadlines around here and my coordination with the clerks on ballots and envelopes. Small piece, it's a lot easier than coordinating all of that. We also draft the warnings for all of these statewide elections and make sure the clerks have them in time to post them, which is 30 days before the election. So we've done checklists, we've done ballot creation and envelopes and compliance with the federal laws for mailing out ballots. Another primary thing that is the responsibility of our office is procurement management and provision of the various election systems to the clerks. Primarily, this includes the tabulators, of course, for the towns that use them, the accessible voting system, which is available in every town, whether you use a tabulator or not. That's another federal law. You need to have an accessible voting system available in every polling place. That evolved over time from a phone-based system years ago, which was cutting edge at its time, but quickly became moribund. And we now have a really state-of-the-art, what's called a ballot marking device, which is essentially a tablet that allows persons with disabilities to record their choices in a number of ways depending on the disability that they might have. So there's, audio options and options for folks who have dexterity issues, all the way to a sip and puff ability to record your votes on this tablet. And then importantly, and we worked a lot with the vendor on this, you then print your ballot right there. We developed a custom printer that prints edge to edge on tabulator readable stock so that those ballots come out looking exactly like the pre-printed ballots and can be fed through the tabulator and processed with the rest of the ballots. The whole point of that is to get to the privacy of these votes so that in previous iterations of accessible voting systems, the ballot that came out of them looked entirely different from everybody else's ballot, and that reduces sort of the privacy associated with those votes and voters. If you can think about it, in a lot of towns and cities across Vermont, there may be only one or two people who need to use that device. And if you then can distinguish the look and feel of those ballots out of the rest of the pile that everybody's counting, it's not good. So we figured out a way around that provision of these systems. And then, so I said the tabulator is the accessible voting system. And then the other big one is just the election management software. We house the software that tracks all of this stuff, candidate filings. It's where the clerks work with their checklists, enter their candidates, enter their results after the election, all that they need to do around election management from a software perspective. And so, of course, that includes constant training, updates to that system, critiques of it from the clerks, it failing from time to time and needing to be quickly addressed. So it's a constant sort of care of a very large software system that we're responsible for.
Representative Boyden had a question.
Yeah, just a quick question. In my area, I know one of our towns is a new tabulator and another one is still counting. I'm curious to know how many times they're still not using a tabulator.
It's a little less than 100. I'm sorry. I should have that exact number for you, but it's about, so you're talking 150 that do and 100 that don't. We produce a really comprehensive guide for use and maintenance of the tabulators that the clerks rely on heavily. The tabulators and the accessible voting system both, of course, need to be programmed for each election. Here, you got a tabulator. I spoke about the 275 ballot styles across the state. The tabulator needs to know which of those ballot styles is coming into it and which races to look for and the positioning of those races on that ballot. So first we create the 275 ballot styles, and then the tabulator company has to program 275 different programs to read those and distribute those out to the clerks. That's what are then subject to pre-election testing. So you get your cards for the tabulator, you put them in the machine, and then you got to test a bunch of ballots to make sure that they're in fact programmed correctly and set up to read them correctly. So that's where the clerks will sit there, and we have guidance on how to do the most effective test of your tabulator to make sure that every oval is tested. You kind of do enough ballots to get at all of the various combinations that might occur. And right, you hand tabulate at that point, what are the votes I've recorded on these 10 or 15 test ballots? So what do I expect to see come out on the tabulator tape after I run them through? You run them through, you print the tape, and you compare the two. They're deadly accurate, and those tests always are 100% on. And then you know that you're good to go. You zero it out. There's an important step where you then scrape, of course, all of those test ballots off of the programming, and it's zeroed and ready to go for election day. They're required to do that before every election on those and the accessible voting system.
Representative Waters Evans.
Hi, I'm Shay. I'm from Charlotte, Shay Waters Evans. I know that those ballots come with all the instructions. This is another topic, but they're a little confusing for people, I think. The town clerk, you know what I mean, when they're getting people to fill them out. But I know that they say to fill it out, it's like black ink or something. So what do you do with the ballots that come in with a purple crayon with a big, you know what I mean, like a heart around it or something, instead of, you know what I mean, instead of just filling it with a black box? I'm sure that there are varied ways that people respond. What happens to those ballots?
What I'll say in that instance and in a number of other instances you can think of where ballots may come back in any kind of condition that makes them unreadable by the tabulator, whether it's what they're marked with, how they're marked, whether they're damaged, wrinkled, ripped. Statute lays out that you basically have two options. You can hand count them and add the hand counted ballots to the totals that come out on the tape from the tabulator after the election. Or, and what's more common, I think Carol would say, is you're allowed to transfer them to election officials in the town, can take the votes off of the ballot marked with the purple crayon and mark a separate ballot, same votes, with an appropriate pencil, a pen, black pen.
So it would be like a town clerk who did that, or a voting counter?
Specifically to election officials.
Oh, okay.
In the town and working together. That I think is one of the places in statute where it prioritizes or asks for those two election officials to be of different parties. But it was either 2 or 4 years ago, we acknowledged the fact that in a lot of towns, there may not even be election officials of a given party, and put language in the statute that says, if you're unable to comply with that party balance requirement, you have to make an effort to, but if it's impossible, that it can be waived and it can just be two election officials regardless of party. But that it's the transfer onto a readable ballot that's the real way we deal with that.
Representative Chase.
The original is kept for record or paperclip to the copy or destroyed or?
Good question too. There's an envelope that we refer to as the replaced ballot envelope, where those go. I believe, Carol, am I right? The statute now even requires you to rip those in half?
The statute, hi all, Carol does, Perry City Clerk
Does.
Treasurer. The statute requires you to label the ballot that you are transferring the votes from, and to have both of the election workers sign it as indicating they have made the transfers. And then all the other ballots that go into the replaced ballot envelope do get torn, but we leave those ones whole, so that if for some reason there were ever some kind of an audit, we would have those whole ballots.
That replaced ballot envelope is kind of key, and you want those to all go to a place where they're not then counted. That's what you want to be sure, is that they don't somehow get double counted after a replacement has been.
And is there a code to match the replacement for the replaced? Okay.
Well, could you talk about why that is a little bit, that the ballots, once they've, been printed, you talked about this in terms of the printout from the ABS systems, why each ballot doesn't have some specific, marker that marks it as where it came from?
Well, voter anonymity is the reason. And yeah, there is never anything on a ballot that indicates which voter cast that ballot.
If I might just give an example, we have one voter who traditionally votes. He lives overseas and he votes every election. He gets his ballot through the My Voter page. So he prints it off in his home in China, votes it, mails it back. So it's on a different kind of paper. And so you would be able to identify who that voter is if you knew that process. And so it's important for us to maintain as much anonymity as we can by not cross-referencing the ballots.
So even if you are counting the ballots by hand, are you still making the transfer onto a new ballot of, say they did the example that you just gave of printing the ballot at home or filling it in with a purple crayon, just to make sure that it's not recognizable?
No, I mean, you would risk double counting it. You would double count it in that case. So if you're going to hand count them, they go in another place that are ballots that have been hand counted.
What if you're hand counting like all of them?
I want to make clear the question that you're asking. So I think what you're getting at, Representative Boyden, is that this isn't really it. So if in the Purple Crown example, that's not really an issue when all the ballots are being hand counted. I think it's up to the discretion of the elections official, so the clerk in most cases, whether or not they would take advantage of the transfer or whether they would just keep the Purple Crown ballot in the stack that gets hand counted. But in either case, there would only be, in the counted ballots, one stack of counted ballots. And if they did do a replacement ballot, the Purple Crown ballot would go into the replacement envelope and would not be counted.
Yeah, no, and thank you. That in towns that hand count ballots, a lot of these extra procedures aren't necessary because you just got humans reading the marks on the paper and deciding the voter's intent based on those. And then everything's going in the ballot bag as soon as the hand count is conducted after the polls close. Carol's commentary reminded me of a point I should touch on, that for the military and overseas voters, and now also voters with disabilities, the law, and this was a fairly recent change also 2 or 4 years ago, allows for us to electronically deliver the ballots to those folks. It's absolutely critical for the people overseas and the military voters. So on that same 45th day, that Friday I'm talking about, if the clerks have entered the requests into our system and indicated that the person wants electronic delivery, when the system works at midnight on that Friday, any of those ballots requested by electronic delivery are blast sent out to the voters who have requested them. It's interesting for efficiency and security reasons, they're not, for instance, attached. It's not a PDF of the ballot attached to an email as it used to be. What now happens is the voter gets a notifying email from our system and then instructs them how they can log in through their My Voter page, which requires their unique identifying information and access that ballot. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail. I know time's of the essence. You actually have the option at that point to use a ballot marking tool that is the same as what I described on the tablet at the polling place, but online. So you can say, access my ballot online. It takes you to an interface that is exactly very near to what you see on that tablet in the polling place. And so somebody at home during the early voting period with disabilities can, in theory, vote privately and independently through their home device. Again, hit print, and this is the point I was trying to get to. That electronic delivery gets it to these voters overseas instantaneously, right, on the 45th day. They're then still required by our law to mail a paper version of their marked ballot back to the clerk. And in our experience, even that can be difficult for folks with a 45-day time frame to get ballots voted and back to the clerks via mail.
I will just say, in the spirit of disclosure language, that I hope to present maybe end of next week as part of a committee bill proposal. We'll have this question about whether there might be a secure way to allow electronic return for those voters who currently are allowed to to get a ballot electronically. So it's one of those accessibility questions that I'd like us to dig into a little bit. So we'll definitely take more on this, but Representative Chase, did you have a question on that?
That was it.
Oh, great. Sorry.
You also have real quickly, they also have the option, they don't have to use the online ballot marking interface. They also can go directly into the My Voter page, and there's a PDF version that they can print. What we do in both cases, right, is you also have to send instructions for mailing it back. So put it in an envelope, and we send a PDF version of the same certificate language that goes on the voted ballot envelope that you would get if you were mailed here stateside. So they print out that certificate, sign it, affix it to a blank envelope, mailing envelope, put the ballot in that, and then mail it back to the clerk in a mailer so that you still get it in a sealed voted ballot envelope with that certificate language on the outside. This goes into the early and absentee voting, and especially the military
Yes,
overseas.
sorry, I was trying to write as you were talking, and I missed what you said about envelopes from the My Voter page folks that are voting.
Just that they get a copy of the certificate language that needs to be affixed to an envelope.
So they do have to provide their own envelope.
Yes. Yep. That's what you lose with the electronic delivery. If voters request those ballots by mail overseas, we mail them the return envelope and return package. But then it's just, you have less time to get it back. That's good. We've covered some of the stuff that I'm going, that's further down the outline. I do want to mention that another, primary responsibility of our office is provision of guidance and training to clerks on all aspects of election administration. Every couple of years, we produce a new version of this election procedures guide, which has been around forever, which is kind of the A to Z for election officials, updated as the law is updated every couple of years. And probably the most important part of it is how many appendices do we have? We have A through N right now of appendices of various documents that the clerks use. These are the various affidavits and affirmations that you might see at the polling place, checklists for what goes in the ballot bag, notice of voter rights to post at the polls, all kinds of useful resources for the clerks here. In addition to producing this and other training materials, we every election year summer conduct trainings across the state, usually between 6 and 8 geographically. We try and spread them out across the state. In July, it's always, we don't want to do them too early because everybody forgets. So we try and do them in July, just on the eve of the August primary. We also pretty much always do a pretty lengthy session at the clerks conference in September. That's where we try and talk about general election specific instructions for the clerks since we're past the primary at that point and going into the general election. We always appreciate the invite from the VMCTA to do a session at their annual meetings. And then, God, it seems like it's there's almost always something that requires additional training also in a 2-year cycle. So new tabulators, last year we did new tabulator trainings across the state. 2 years before that with the accessible voting system, we did trainings on the accessible voting system across the state. When we're getting a new election management system this year, we'll do trainings next year on working with the new election management software. So it's a constant sort of ongoing education from our office to the clerks where we can help them with any of the elements of the elections that we're responsible for. I'm going to skip over. So all of the absentee balloting and tracking, it's just interesting. That is another place where the federal government wants to know what we're up to. There's a report that we're required to file. It's coming up here in February for the 2022 elections with the federal entity known as the Election Assistance Commission, the EAC. And that is a huge data set about all kinds of data from Vermont elections. How many ballots were requested, how many went out, voter registration statistics. Those are the two biggie, absentee ballot statistics and voter reg statistics. And that's one of the significant features of the election management software that we develop is we try to develop it in such a way that it can then pretty easily, with the click of a button, export the data that's required for that reporting to the Election Assistance Commission every year. It used to be a much more laborious process of collecting the data individually from town clerks and creating a huge spreadsheet. We've now got it where if they've been tracking this activity throughout the election cycle, it can essentially be exported on a one-time basis after the election's done. The other really significant part of our responsibility is the overseeing of the reporting of election results. That also happens through our online election management system. This is important to a lot of folks currently with a lot of the baseless allegations about vote tabulation, manipulation. In Vermont, just to be really clear with everybody, the tabulators aren't connected to the internet, of course. They are completely standalone devices. They don't have any modems. They don't have any ability to talk outside of the bounds of that hardware, except for the result tape that's printed out, and that's a printed tape. So in those tabulator towns, the clerks take that printed results tape and then hand enter it into our election management software after having logged into that software through their two-factor identification. Whether the ballots are counted by hand or whether they're taking those results off the result tape in the hand count towns, the clerk ends up with a summary sheet from all of the hand counters that has the totals at the end of the night. And those are reported into the election management system. The clerks are required to do that by law on election night now. That's where you all get those election results coming in. And we're up till midnight or 2 o'clock working with 2 or 3 clerks that are struggling with their data entry in the system. Those are the unofficial election night results on election night. Then within 48 hours after that, the clerks go back in and have to enter official results just really quickly so you guys can envision it. It'll present what they entered on election night in one column, and then they're going down and entering their official results, flag for them if there's any change. But that there are instances where that's a mistake being made. There are other instances where that changes because something has changed between the unofficial reports and the official results entry. So it doesn't require them to be the same. You wouldn't want it to require them to be the same. That's exactly the point, is that mistakes can be made late at night on election night, and you can correct for those on the official returns. Those official returns are then sort of combined by the software and create and present the screens and the interface for the canvassing to happen. So like in your rep districts, if one of you represents a town with a district with 3 towns, the software knows that and will pull the results from your race, from the rep race, from those 3 towns, combine them and present them to the clerk that's responsible for canvassing those results.
For the uninitiated, there is one district clerk, even if there are multiple clerks that are collecting the ballots, there is one in each of our districts, right?
And it's the clerk of the whole town with the largest population. So even if if the district takes, which happens, of course, half of a big city, but then has a whole small town attached to that, it would be the whole small town clerk. That would be the rep clerk for that district. So you got the rep clerks and then the Senate clerks that do the Senate district canvassing, the county clerks that do the county canvassing, and our office does the statewide canvassing. So for the statewide candidates, we get the results combined from all 247 towns and sign off on those with the party chairs 1 week after the election. All of those canvasses require certain people to be there. The rep district level, Carol, it's the clerk and one other election official from the district.
Correct.
At the Senate and county level, the chairs of the county committees appear with the county clerks to do those canvasses. And at the statewide canvass a week after the election, we have the chairs of the major parties or their designees that come to the Secretary of State's office. So we also then, you can imagine, recounts occur after those canvasses. My office is responsible for sort of oversight and coordination of recounts. I have to work with the tabulator company to get new cards programmed for the recounts. And I work very closely with the county clerks, who interestingly are responsible for administration of the recounts. That's a nuance of Vermont election law that has always made me wonder, in that the county clerks have literally no role in election administration other than receiving petitions, and then are asked to oversee the conduct of recounts. And I can tell you it makes them very nervous. So we do as much as we can to provide guidance to the county clerks and how those recounts are conducted. We're also responsible for reporting the results of the federal races up to the appropriate federal entities, telling them who won. And we conduct the electoral college process in presidential election years. Last but not least, on top of all of this, and I know the focus was on the sort of nuts and bolts of the election administration, but my office is also responsible for oversight and conducting of all of the campaign finance disclosures. And so campaign finance reports from candidates at all levels get filed with our office. Local elections used to file with the clerks, but they now file with us. You're all pretty familiar with the campaign finance system. I would say that Secretary Condos, former Secretary Condos, used to say we're essentially a filing cabinet. That is to say we don't have enforcement authority. We do as much guidance as we can. You know that JP in my office is probably on all of your speed dials when it comes to campaign finance time. He does a great job with that. And filing cabinet is true in that we don't have enforcement authority. We try and do as much guidance in terms of compliance as we can. And I would just say we used to really physically be a filing cabinet. When all of this was done on paper, there's a lot more space in our offices now that we've moved to the online filing system, which has been an unmitigated success since it went into place in 2016.
Representative Wiki.
Thanks for all this, Will. This may be a question coming out of the cold, so I don't expect an answer now, but if you could get back to us in regards to campaign finance filings, you have a number about percentage of compliance?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, so if you could get back to us.
I will.
Yeah. Yes, you all will.
I'm pretty sure again that the former secretary sort of highlighted that at one point during the season last year. So I might look back at what the numbers he came up with were. I would tell you in general, right? Ultimate compliance is pretty good. I think you're talking about late, how many come in late? Timely compliance, thank you. And that's, I mean, I would say it, total guess off the top of my head, hovers around 30% not being on time across the board.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, you had more go. I thought you were done.
There's been significant debate, as you know, in past years about whether there may be late fees applied to those, and so far that hasn't happened.
Just, were you done your presentation? What was beyond? It's just a general question to ask at the end. You are more or less. Okay. It made me think of the day when Rep. Labor came in and presented his bill. Went home that night and I remembered something that a individual had told me. They'd gone to one of the local post office the day the ballots got mailed in that town to that, and they had a post office box. And he said, I went over by the recycle bin and there was numerous, I don't know how many numerous was, if numerous meant 3 or if it was 30 ballots thrown in the recycle bin. Has your office given any direction to post office in those scenarios? Has that been addressed? Because his concern is, the term, a lot of people don't like it, but it's ballot harvesting.
Right.
And valid, I would say, in that situation is a concern, but have you all thought that one through? Has that been investigated?
A number of questions there, but yes is the primary answer, and I appreciate it because it gives me a chance to mention something I didn't. I'm assuming though, from what you're describing, that, so it was a recycling bin out in the public area of the post office.
Yes.
So it's people who got them.
Yep,
Their PO.
not voting, tossed in the recycle bin.
Not implying that the postal service employees were putting anything in the.
No,
recycling.
implying John Q. Public went in, picked up his or her mail, decided that not voting, threw it in the recycle bin for whatever reason.
So I would say, I don't remember having any specific conversations about that fact pattern with the Postal Service, but I will. But what that gives me the opportunity to say is, since we started mailing ballots to all voters, especially so starting in 2020, that was one thing I was going to get to. You said sort of what's the history here? That was the first time that we mailed ballots to all voters for the general election in response to COVID under the emergency legislation. Beginning then and throughout until now, we now have a really close working relationship with the Postal Service. I'm in direct contact with the person that's known as the political mail coordinator for the Postal Service. There's one of those people that serve Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire. It's changed hands now once since 2020. But in 2020 and then again in this election year, I mean, probably a weekly basis at least that I'm talking with these folks discussing all number of issues around the ballot mailing. And that's something I could bring up as sort of security around waste bins and recycle bins in the public area of the Postal Service around the ballot mailing time. It also gives me an opportunity to just point out though, and it's really important with this concern about, you said it, what was the term? Ballot harvesting, thank you. And, I've heard live ballots referred to. The control point on the absentee ballot process and the mailing of ballots process is the return of those ballots to the clerk.
Right.
Really specifically, that the clerk will only ever accept a single ballot from a given person.
Yep.
They get checked off the checklist as your return, and if a second ballot were to come back, name of that person, that's when we start looking into what's going on.
Sure.
And so no matter how many ballots are out there in the ether, in the recycle bin, or the 3 extra that got sent to the previous resident of your house, which we hear about all the time,
Sure.
or the one I got from my son who's moved to Colorado, and how the hell could you do that? Well, your son needs to call the clerk and say, I've moved to Colorado, and then you won't get a ballot for him or her in the next election. Again, those can't all be returned on behalf of somebody because the clerk is keeping really close track of what's come back.
His concern was this, beyond that. So obviously it'd be somebody that lacks integrity that did such an act, of course.
Yep.
Takes the ballot. This might be something Carol has insight on too, but signs that person's name. They open up, see who the name is. They have no idea what my signature, Bob's signature, Lisa's signature. They really, and they aren't going to know. They would have to have a data bank that had that and go, yeah, that looks like it's not. And I'm not trying to nitpick it, but I mean, literally somebody could just go, we'll send it. There you go, boom. And it's in, and they're going to go, yep, throw that in the feeder. Because if we have drop boxes, like I know in my town, we have a drop box where you can drop it 24/7 during the process,
Correct.
once you've had it. So that was his concern. And I said, hey, that's valid. And I, you know, in defense of the Postal Service, I applaud them. They have a recycling bin because people get a lot of junk mail they don't want. They want to get it recycled and not throw it in the waste stream. So it's a tough one. But it's a piece of situational awareness. I want it out there.
Definitely.
Well, what would be the difference between somebody signing that affidavit on a certified envelope and impersonating somebody by mail legally and someone showing up and claiming to be someone else on election day in person and stating their name and getting the ballot handed to them? I mean, is it the same? It's
about the same
crime, right?
Yeah. Yep. And it's, that's why there's specific and clear language on those envelopes about the pains and penalties of perjury. $10,000 in fines and up to 15 years in prison, I think. There is always the risk for those folks. So right out there's a bin full of ballots in the post office.
Yeah.
I'm going to fill one of those out, perjure myself, sign on behalf of somebody else. Knowing there's always the risk there. Who are the people who are throwing those in the recycling bin? The people who say, I want to vote on election day. And then when that person shows up and votes on election day and their name is marked off as having a ballot returned on their behalf.
Now they got a problem.
Now you start looking into what's going on.
Yeah.
It's been my experience that doesn't happen, frankly.
I hope not.
And, you can't know what you don't know. I acknowledge that also.
Sure. And there's always going to be some gotchas that.
Yep.
I know. It's just nature of the beast, but yeah.
I like that. I think it boils down to the risk reward of that situation. It's a whole lot of risks to take on to cast one additional ballot in a Vermont election, where the results typically aren't close on the order of one vote.
I would concur. It's a high level of risk for perjuring yourself, like you said.
Yeah. And I just think, I'm not saying it doesn't happen or that it's an impossibility, but I think that's why we don't see it.
It was just a valid one that I thought was thrown out there, and I thought y'all ought to be aware of it if you weren't.
100%.
Representative Rowicki.
Well, I know secretaries of state and their officers talk state to state.
Yes.
There are states like Utah, Oregon, that have been doing this for quite a while, mailing ballots.
Yep.
Are they finding fraud like this is rampant?
No.
Representative Hango and then Representative Barman.
There's no evidence of it.
I saw somewhere in your presentation about college students, but I didn't hear you say anything about college students. How is the Vermont law written for college students to be able to vote in state?
I don't believe I have anything in here
I thought I
college
saw
students,
it.
but either way.
I saw it in here, but now I can't find it again, so.
That is an
I must have dreamed it.
Vermont law treats them no differently from anybody else. So if you consider Vermont to be your principal dwelling place is the actual language in the statute, and that you intend to remain here, you can register to vote here, whether you're a college student or otherwise. You can't be registered in more than one place. That's very clear. So college students who choose to register here while they're in Vermont should be removing themselves from any roles in their home states.
And that's on the honor system.
For the most part, yes. In addition to just that part of the answer and how Vermont law treats them, there's U.S. Supreme Court precedent that says college students can register and vote in the place where they're attending school. So that's a little bit out of our hands because it's been asked by the court.
Thank you.
I really appreciate, Will, you're taking us on a pretty broad journey of all of this elections policy. I knew you were up to the task, and I also am excited because this was my hope that we would get some of these thoughts cooking, have people kind of get a basic sense of what's going on and get the chance to ask some questions. Because once we start getting into some language about various details about election policy that we might consider improving or changing, increase accessibility, increase security. These are the kinds of discussions that we're going to have, and everybody being so engaged today. So, Bill, I think you were going to talk about calendar a little bit with us. And I know we're bumping up against when I said we would take a break. Is the committee okay with plowing ahead a little bit? And do you have a hard stop where you make it back? I don't want to, because we'll have time to come back, but I would love to keep going a little bit and kind of wrap up Bill's presentation. Maybe take a quick break. And Carol, I don't know if you would prefer to talk about some of the legislative priorities of the Vermont Clerks and Treasurers Association with a few minutes after that, or if you wanted to maybe hold that, because I'd like to have you back when we look over some draft language next week, because I know one of the things we're going to talk about is about the write-in issue next week. So I don't know if you have a preference on going a little longer today versus saving it for next time.
I'd like to kind of split the difference.
Okay, great.
I've got a few things that I'd like to say to augment Will's comments. But then moving into an additional discussion about proposed changes, including the write-in stuff. Certainly happy to come back and talk about that.
Great. So then I will exercise my chair's discretion and say, let's plow ahead and we'll break a little early if that works for the committee. Great.
Which, go to Carol's supplement of me yet, or no? Is she waiting till you to finish up?
If that works for you, Will, that might be a good break before we kind of look at the calendar. Yeah, great. So Carol, please take it away. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay. First of all, I feel like I'm looming over Will's shoulder there.
I know.
It's more like you're sitting like next to or behind him from my perspective.
I've been really careful not to make faces as he's been. The one thing that I will say is that we have an incredible working relationship with the election division at the Secretary of State's office. Will and I are in frequent contact, including this morning, talking about ways to make improvements, changes, what's working, what isn't, particularly as new things are rolled out, like universal mailing. And so know that I would say 99.9% of the time we are on the same page and pulling together. So one thing I will say, however, Will went over the process that is almost exclusively tied to general elections. And he mentioned in passing that there are local elections, and actually for those of us in the field, we do more of those than we do state elections. And they have completely different deadlines, timelines, processes. Not completely different, but it's a whole second group of information that clerks need to be aware of and working on. Right now, we're all very busy with town meeting, which isn't that far away. So we're working on that. The other thing I'll say is he held up a copy of the handbook, the election handbook, and I would say that that we consider that gold, not only because the cover is gold this year, but because of the contents. It is definitely our go-to book, and we appreciate it greatly, including all the appendices. Forgive me because my comments are going to be just a little scattershot. I made quick notes as Will was talking. He started off early by saying that there's no provision in statute for recalls of elected officials, and that is true. However, there are a few communities that have adopted language in their charters that does allow for recalls. So there are a few exceptions to that. He also mentioned the fact that that VMCTA, or at least me personally, I don't like the word challenged, and I'd love to be able to find a different term to refer to those voters that are essentially inactive and have been sent a notice asking them if they still qualify to be on the voter checklist. Let me see here. There was a lot of talk about the undeliverable ballots, the ballots that come back to clerks as undeliverable from the universal mailing. And I wanted to just give you an idea of what we do in our office. They're all kept. We use them actually as a resource. Frequently we'll find that they came back to us because maybe they were missing an apartment number. That's kind of the most common reason that they're returned to us as undeliverable. And so when voters come in and request or call us on the phone to request an absentee ballot, first thing we do is go through that stack of undeliverables. Do we actually have their ballot there? We just didn't have a good mailing address. So we can update our records and we can mail that ballot out to them. We also bring those ballots with us to the polls for the same reason. We know in our entrance checklist which voters have been mailed a ballot. It's indicated on the checklist. And if somebody comes to the polls and says, I want to vote, and we know that they were mailed a ballot, but they haven't voted it, we look in the box. Do we have their ballot there? If so, that gives us an opportunity to update our records with whatever their mailing address is and let them vote that ballot. So they are actually a great tool for us to continue to make the updates and cleanups that we need to do to our voter checklist. Let's see here. Will talked about the testing of the tabulators, which is referred to as logic and accuracy testing, and how what we do is we mark a bunch of ballots and we run them through the tabulators, and then we also hand tally them to confirm that the tabulators are reading correctly. And I will say that when you've got a discrepancy, it's always in the hand counting. It's always that somehow human error has messed up in counting the ballots. So to me, that's just a continuing surety that the tabulators are accurately reporting our elections. I talked about that. With regards to the post office and the universal mailings, we're finding here in Berry City that the post office is really challenged by being short-staffed, getting mail to us, but we have certainly found for the 22 election that they took ballot mailings extremely seriously and were very thorough in making sure that we were getting ballots timely. I was surprised late afternoon on election day when I turned around and our postmaster was standing there with a stack of ballots that they had just received in the post office, and he had actually delivered them to the polls. And I was very appreciative of his extra efforts, and I heard similar stories from other clerks. So I know the post office is taking the process really seriously. The other thing is, at the end of Will's comments, you were talking about ballot harvesting or opportunities for people to perhaps vote a ballot that isn't theirs. And I will say that there are a number of different checks and balances to the system. We data enter into the system when we get a ballot back, and the system looks across the state with that information. If a voter comes to Berry City and registers and requests an absentee ballot, and I go into the system to enter that request, and they've already voted in their previous town, the system tells me that, and the system won't let me even register that person until after the election, because they have already had their opportunity to vote in the election. The system also will let us know, to get back to that point, we had a situation this year where that came up. And there was some question. I reached out to the Secretary of State's office. I reached out to the clerk in that other town. And it turned out that there had been a data entry error and that the wrong voter had been entered as having voted. And this is the checks and balances that allows us to correct these errors and make sure that the right voters are voting. So it's important that we know that there are ways that these discrepancies are being caught, and that that the vast majority of the times it's an innocent error. It's not an attempt by somebody to get away with something nefarious. We had a woman come to the polls at the November election, and she went up to vote, and according to our entrance checklist, she had already voted. And she said, no, I did not vote absentee. And they sent her over to me. And I was able to look through, because we have all our absentee ballots there at the polls. I was able to show her her certificate envelope and say to her, is this your signature? And she said, yeah, it is. I clearly voted and forgot that I had voted. So again, there are these ways that we have checks and balances in place. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being with us today, Carol, and for talking through some of the, just listening and responding to some of the conversation here today from the municipal treasurer's point of view. I really appreciate your perspective. And I imagine we'll be hearing from you more as we get into doing some of our elections bills that are currently in drafting.
Yes, I'm with Senate Gov.Ops this afternoon talking about the ranked choice voting bill. So.
Yeah, I'm going to let them have that conversation. Have a great time over there. We'll see what where they land. Great. So I think the last area here that I wanted to have Will give us a little bit of more of an overview is in the elections timeline and the calendar. I think that was the last big chunk, and then we'll let our brains rest a little bit on elections.
Yeah, and I appreciate you guys slogging through this. This is what you get when you ask Will to come in and give an overview of elections. Before I get to that timeline really quickly, I want to really thank Carol for all of those comments, and especially noting the tracking in the system, because it is really important. And I didn't mention that. And so many people think that we're not keeping track of this stuff, and the clerks are really on top of it with the aid of the software that we've built. It is not the Wild West. We aren't just sending out 450,000 ballots and taking back whatever comes back and then letting whoever votes at the polls vote at the polls. Quite the opposite. And Carol, I don't think that I didn't proactively send you a copy of this outline. It was posted, so I'm sorry if you didn't get it. But that I just wanted to point out, we were just at the spot where I was going to talk about how much you guys do as well, and about local elections, which you've now done for me. But I just wanted to point out, under my local heading, when you get to town clerks responsible for, I said everything.
Yes.
On both, though, on the statewide elections, and one really quick point, and the local elections, what's really important in terms of appreciating the work that the clerks do is they're responsible for operation of the polling place on election day, and scheduling of all the hours of election officials, preparing their election officials, setting it up, taking it down, reporting the results, and that's no small task. So they're the folks on the ground on election day managing the election. And again, for the local elections, everything, the recounts and everything that comes before the elections. To get to the timelines, I mentioned before, I think that the 46-day deadline drives a lot of the various internal timelines that we have for getting stuff together. But I think what you're sort of most interested in, right, is some of the filing deadlines and pre-election stuff. So just really quickly, for the presidential primary, it's the most straightforward, of course. It's a single office of president. It's two parties, Democratic and Republican. we're creating a ballot for. Essentially, there's a filing deadline in mid-December. It's December 15th in 2023 for us to receive petitions to appear on the presidential primary ballot. Then shortly after that, the reason that deadline is in December and mid-December is because in mid-January, we come up against the UOCAVA deadline to mail out the ballots 46 days before. Warning posting, like all other elections, is 30 days before. And as I mentioned, the presidential primary takes place on the first Tuesday in March, lined up with town meeting day. Then then the dates for the primary, and I had my staff go through and put in what will be the actual dates coming up in 2024. But more important probably now is just to realize what drives those in the statute. I mentioned before that sort of the whole primary process and all of the filing deadlines for party committee nominations and independent candidates are all in an effort to build the general election ballot, right? The primary is simply a nominating process for parties to decide who from their party is going to appear on the general election ballot, which is the true election. As you all know, across the country, the nominating process by parties looks different. There are caucuses in some places. There are primaries at different times in the calendar. So it all needs to be complete right around when we get the primary election results in August. I mentioned to Rep. Higley before that, we moved that primary election date up to the second Tuesday in August to give enough time to create the general election ballots. That would serve no purpose if we then were getting a whole bunch of other filings after the primary that also need to be included on the general election ballot. So essentially you'll see that this is set up to right around when we're getting the primary results, we've got everybody else that needs to be put on that general election ballot also, so that I can send that to the printers. So for the primary, you file early. It's end of April is the start date, and the end of May is the deadline. And so you've got about a month window in which you can submit your petitions to appear on the ballot for the primary election. Those are driven, just like everything else, by the need to produce those primary ballots and have them in the hands of the clerks 46 days prior, which is middle of June. So you can see we get those petitions on May 30th, got about 3 weeks to create 275 ballot styles across 3 parties, finalize it, proof those, get them printed, get them shipped and delivered to the clerk's offices in time to send them out to the military and overseas voters.
Well, could you give very briefly, what is a major party in Vermont? Just like why do we have a major party versus independent candidates? What is the Secretary of State's Elections Division doing, being involved in primaries for major parties?
I would love to not be involved in primaries for major parties, but so be it.
Say something.
No, but so be it, and that's the case in many places. We have the ability to administer a statewide election, and just historically have played that role for the parties. What is one? There are biennials, so every 2 years, parties go through an organization process. The gist of it is that you have to organize in a minimum number of towns across the state, and then counties, and then have a statewide committee to be considered a statewide party. It's off the top of my head, I think it's at least 30 towns, and it's years back now, 6 or 8 years back, they put in extra language that says it has to be in a certain number of counties. I think in 7 counties at least. They wanted to avoid, just parties only kind of really existing in a small geographic location. You get at 30 towns with, 2 southern counties potentially. And then it's a place we could clean up in the statute, Mr. Chair. There's also, in the definition of a major party in the statute, the requirement that you have to get 5% or more of the vote in a statewide office in every general election is sort of the other threshold that drives being a major party. So there's those kind of baseline, just show us that you have a level of support among Vermonters to continue being a party requirements to organize and be a major party, and then also meet this 5% threshold in the statute. There's then what we call minor parties that basically can organize in one or more towns, and the county and a state committee give themselves a name, call themselves a minor party, and nominate candidates to appear on the general election ballot. I believe you have to have a minimum of 10 towns organized in order to nominate candidates for statewide offices. So we have some minor parties that will organize kind of locally, not get to 10 towns, and only be able to nominate candidates for House rep.
Does that 30 towns in certain number of counties align with, like, that's a number of people? Does that align with 5% of the vote as far as total?
Not necessarily, I don't think.
How many people would it represent in order to start a party?
Well, it's that you need, I think I understand what you're asking. You need about 3 people in each of those towns is the minimum to organize a town. So times 30.
So the distinction is between the definition for a major party. In order to become a major party, it's the number of towns, but then it's having that percentage of statewide office in a statewide election. So it's also all the voters hit that 5%, but the organizing only takes a caucus of at least 3 people in each of the towns.
So the first year they wouldn't be able to be on the ballot for a statewide. Sounds like a self-licking ice cream cone if they can't be a party to be on the ballot, so they can't be voted for 5%. Am I missing something?
No, you aren't. I probably am. And with permission, I would come back sometime and very more clearly remind myself and lay out for the committee the party organization requirements, if that's.
Yeah, I think we're making a distinction between what needs to happen for the existing major parties to continue to renew versus if you were to try to establish a new major party, that would have a different process, which I don't think we've seen for a while. Hence, I'd love to get. But that's I think some of us who've done this stuff for a while, we know what the process is because we have 3 major parties that meet these requirements, but I don't know that anybody's tried to stand up a new major party in Vermont in recent memory.
Not since I've been here. So at least 10 years. I should know the exact answer to this, but we're one of the only states with more than 2. It's not very common. Back to the timeline quick. Primary election happens on the 2nd Tuesday in August, like we said. So your deadlines are May. I get the ballots ready. We get the ballots out in June. Election happens in August. We don't have to spend a lot of time on the results. Like I said, official results 48 hours after. The canvassing process is kind of interesting. In the primary, the canvasses take place at a different time frame depending on the office. For single town house districts, they canvass the next day, which is kind of crazy. So they file their official return of vote. You can think about that. If it's a single town office, the official return of vote for that town is the final results for that office. There's no combining of results to happen. So they can essentially submit that official return of vote to us and then sign off on it as being canvassed. The canvass of the Senate offices and multi-town rep districts is the Friday after. That makes sense. That gives the time to combine those ORVs from the multi-town districts. And then the state offices are a week after that. These are, I think, some of the deadlines you wanted to pay closest attention to, Mr. Chair. For the November general election, right, the filing deadlines for anybody else besides your primary petitions are, like I said, filings to appear on the general election ballot. And for independent candidates, their last date to file right now is the Friday before the August primary. The quick history on that, it most recently was the same as your filing deadline at the end of May. Prior to that, it had been after the primary, 3 or 4 days after the primary. So it got moved from after the primary, which was sort of commonly referred to in the nomenclature as a sore loser opportunity, right? So you could lose the primary election that you had filed your petition for in May, and then still had a 3 or 5 day period, I forget how long it was after the primary, to file as an independent candidate and get on the general election ballot that way. That was moved back to align with the major parties at one point. The state got sued over that in 2010, I believe it was. It's Trudell is the name. I could provide the case to the committee if you're curious about it. But the court said it was fine, actually. Constitutional to have the deadline aligned with the primary candidates. Despite that, the legislature, and I forget how long after it was, not long though, either the next year or a couple years, moved the deadline to where it currently stands, which is just before the primary day. That obviously, I think, still provides the opportunity for you to kind of have your finger to the wind in July about how the primary's going. And if you don't think you're doing that well in your party primary, you could in theory file an independent candidate petition to get on the general election ballot. And you can do both those things at the same time, and people do. And so then if you win your primary, you obviously can appear on the general election ballot as the nominee of that party, or you can decline that nomination and operate with the petition that you filed as an independent candidate, or vice versa. You can accept that nomination and say, I'm withdrawing my independent petition. I want to appear as the party nominee.
If someone chooses to to proceed forward as an independent after winning their primary, does whoever come in second place in the primary?
No.
Booted or?
No.
They don't appear on the ballot.
Correct.
So that would theoretically be a way to block somebody from.
Yes, theoretically, if that, you could use that language. The how that plays out would be if you chose to run as an independent, then you withdraw from your party nomination. And that's one of those instances that creates an opportunity for the party committee to nominate a replacement. That's a withdrawal, a death or withdrawal. So you say, okay, I'm not going to be, and then it's 7 days, and that comes up here somewhere where after a candidate either dies or withdraws, the party has 7 days to nominate a replacement.
And, well, the party could choose the second place, but they could choose somebody else in it.
Good point. When I'm asked that question, I always say it, that, I think a really viable option there would be the person who came in second in the primary, but it's not required.
Well, on the scale of the having very open primaries where anyone who's, whether they're affiliated with a major party or not, can get access to very closed primaries where it's really the party, that there's somebody has to be registered and all that. How does Vermont kind of fall on that scale from open to closed in terms of how we have our primaries set up? How do we compare to others?
More on the open side, for sure. Almost entirely on that side of the spectrum. Do you want me to speak a little bit about that, how that works?
If you want to now, I think this issue may come up in the context of some of our, so I'm trying to get folks thinking along certain lines.
No, it's an important concept to be aware of too. So one way that we're unique in Vermont, of course, is when you register to vote here, you don't register by party. You don't register as a Democrat or a Republican or a progressive, which is the case in many states. And in many states where that's sort of the first step. You need to even categorize people that way before you can even talk about whether it's open or closed. In states where you might register by party, then there are states that say you can only vote in the primary in which you are registered. And that's a closed primary. You can't, as a Republican, ask for a Democrat ballot or vice versa. Here, you could also say, even though we're not registered as a party, as a baseline, that you have to request a certain party ballot. But we don't even do that in Vermont either, right? You instead just say, I want to vote in the primary, and you get sent all three. You choose which one to vote. You can only vote in one. That's the itty bitty kind of closed part of it in my mind, right? Is that you can only actually cast votes in one. You can't pick offices across each. But for the same reason that Vermonters in their independent nature don't want to register by party and be categorized as such, we as a state have even resisted requesting a certain party ballot in any given primary, right? And I think the basic reason has been historically that you don't want even that bit of data associated with you and your voter record. Okay, I can look back through the years and see that Bob Hooper has requested a Republican Party ballot every time for the last 6 years.
That wouldn't happen.
You're a Republican in that. It's that we don't have that data. It doesn't exist in Vermont. The very quick history there, did I get into this before? I don't think so, is the national parties at some point, this I learned from my predecessor, Kathy, wanted us to register by party here because they want that data. They want to know who's who across Vermont. Vermont pushed back, said, nope, we're not going to do party registration. As I understand it, the threat from the national parties was, okay, we're going to take away your primary, your presidential primary. Just won't even, consider Vermont as part of that process. The compromise was that maybe there was one nuance in there that they said, well, at least tell us which ballot you're going to pick. Nope, we don't even want to do that. Okay, we're going to take away your primary. The compromise that, and this is the nuance, if y'all remember, you do have to choose which party ballot you're going to get in the presidential primary. And that was okay, as long as we can have that data set, I think we're happy with still having your primary matter. So that's the current status, is that you have to request a certain party ballot for the presidential primary, but that's the only data point in anything I keep on any Vermont voter about which party preference may or may not be.
And was the threat that the national parties held out against Vermont was that they wouldn't seat our delegates?
That's where I don't know the specific details,
but it was something to that effect.
Yes.
Like they were going to say, Vermont, we don't trust you. You're way too open. We have no idea. There are Democrats voting in
right.
Republican voting in Democrat. We don't even know who's who. We're not going to seat your delegates or accept your primaries in our tabulation of who gets to be our presidential nominee.
Where that leaves us is in the sort of unfortunate administrative position of having to send all 3 ballots to any voter who requests a ballot for the primary. And please, when you're thinking about it and you start thinking about folks who are encouraging us to mail ballots to all voters in the primary, like we do in the general election, including the governor's office in their recent signing statement of H42 yesterday, that would mean printing and mailing 450,000 of each party's ballot to every voter. And I'd note on the last page of the outline I provided for you, I gave some turnout numbers for the last 2 election cycles. And if you take a look in the primary, in 2020, there were 941 progressive ballots cast in the primary. And in 2022, there were 610 progressive ballots cast. Similar, there were 58,000 Republican ballots cast in 2020 and only 51,000 cast in 2022. And we would be printing and mailing 450,000 of each of those ballots out to every voter.
So just to be very clear before I take a question, that would be in the instance where we changed current practice and decided to go to universal vote by mail for the primaries in August.
Without addressing the process by which we send all 3 ballots to every voter.
Again, well, as long as we're on this subject, what is the cost or was the cost during the general election to print all those 400 and some thousand ballots? Have that rough figure?
$1.5 million.
Questions, really simple. Absentee votes, is that any mailed ballot or just the people who request an absentee ballot? Because that's kind of a misnomer, right? Because an absentee ballot is different than a universally mailed ballot, is it not?
Yeah, yes.
In terms of definition. So really, when it says absentee votes counted, that really should say, in my mind, mailed vote. or mailed ballots counted or something like that.
Not necessarily, and you're right, that you'll see this appear as absentee dash early
Okay,
votes sometimes. The way I would have you think about that is all ballots that were cast not in person on election day. So if they were received back in the mail by the clerk prior to, or even on election day by the mail, like Carol said, the postmaster coming in. Or you can also, as you know, walk into the clerk's office before election day and vote. Those would be included in the absentee dash early.
so that was just a clarification that I needed, because to
Yep.
me, an absentee ballot is something that I call the town clerk and say, could you please mail me a ballot? Because I'm gonna be out of town or whatever. That to me is an absentee
And
ballot,
before we were mailing ballots out,
right?
yes.
And
Although-
now you can still call for the non-general election, the town meeting election. You can still get your
And the primary.
absentee ballot.
That's right.
My other question is, if there were 506,000 registered voters in the 2020 general election, and then you go to the primary 2022, there are 500,000 registered voters. And then for the 2022 general election, there are 506 registered voters again. What's the discrepancy there?
Changes all the time. The number changes all
By
the time.
6,000.
Or more.
Like, I don't recall like having to register specifically for the primary. I'm a registered voter. So somehow 6,000 people dropped out to be registered for the primary and then came back in and were registered for the general election. How does that
It's a good question. You're right that you don't register by election at all. That is the natural fluctuation of the number of registered voters. And particularly, you often see, and I can show you back through time, it's actually on our website, you can look at it. After a general election, I mentioned before that there's that mandated process by which BCAs review their checklist. We always see in the off election year, the number go down a little bit. And then, right, everybody gets excited about the election in the election year and realize they need to register to vote. So we pick up a lot of registered voters every election year.
But that's still an off year. It's still 2022 to 2022, the primary to the general. We gained the 6,000 back.
Yeah.
It just seems really odd to me. Those numbers just don't seem possible, but
6,000 people can definitely register new between the August primary and the general election.
Yeah, actually,
Amazing.
would expect it to be more, just given,
Yep.
some people fall off because of challenges, they moved, et cetera. And then, you have people register and it's less than it's about 1% of the total, right? So it's not like a 5%.
You asked about the college students before, a bunch of new college students come in the fall.
I get registered.
If I may, the other piece that plays into this is motor voter registration. And I get registrations, bunches of registrations every day through DMV.
I think it's just because the number is 6,000 that it just seems
Seems like
odd
a
to
lot.
me. It goes from 6,000, it goes down 6,000 and then it goes up 6,000.
Yeah,
Maybe it's coincidental.
I think so. But a fine point, you were asking about the cost of the general election mailing, and I was talking about the inefficiency potentially of mailing ballots to all voters for the primary. You think about what do we do now for the primary? The difference is now when we're preparing for the primary, we can look back at these turnout numbers, and that's what we base how many ballots we print on. What is still inefficient, ballot mailing or no, when you have to mail all 3 ballots to everybody who requests one, you look back and you have to base what I'm printing on the biggest number. So we have to look at the Democratic primary numbers to be prepared for the clerks to have enough Democratic ballots to cover all the folks who might participate in the Democratic primary. We need to print the same number of ballots for the other 2 parties also. Because whether it's absentee or at the polls, you get handed all three of those. And so looking back historically, the primary turnouts aren't big, and even for the Democrats, that it's 27%, 30s high. We need to pad a little bit because I never want to be in the situation where clerks are running out of ballots on election day or beforehand. And so we pad that, and historically we've ordered 40 to 50% of the registered voters of pre-printed ballots for the primary. And so you would be doubling or more that number, because if I had to mail to everybody, I have to print 100%.
And it does happen, does it not, that sometimes you have a town that has an unusual primary turnout and clerks do have to
make photocopies
of their ballots.
Yep. And then you got to hand count those. Goes back to what we were talking about before, because those are the try to prevent that.
Yes, understandably. I think that's pretty rare.
Pretty rare. Yeah. A handful of times in my whole experience.
Wiki.
You know how many states do or don't require party registration or declaration even for a primary?
I don't, but I can get you that.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we're pretty unique in that regard.
Especially when we're talking about the logistics of how many it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
One of the things I think we might do is have somebody from NCSL or another kind of nonpartisan organization give us a little primer on what the different options are for primaries and how other states have solved some of these challenges. But we are unique in having three major parties too. So that's another, I don't know that there's another state that has quite the same setup. So we might not be able to compare apples to oranges.
It's a great idea. And there's a woman at NCSL that focuses on election administration that I could probably link you up with.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think it'd be helpful for the committee to just, we're unique in Vermont in so many ways that are wonderful. And this is one where maybe we can look around and say, is there a way to do this where we can balance that the openness with some kind of efficiency, to your point?
If you want the final piece, and this could be really quick, that you had asked me to address, and we've started, is with the universal ballot mailing and the current status of it and which elections it applies to or not. We've been really clear that for these statewide elections, it's only the general election. That's the only one we're doing it right now, not the August primary and not the presidential primary. Just really quickly on the local election side, as it stands under Act 60 passed last year, the legislative body, so the select board or the city council or the village trustees of a town, city, or village, the law is specific. It doesn't just say a municipality. It lists those types, can vote to mail a ballot to all voters for their local elections, town, city, or village. It also says that a school board can do so, but only after receiving the permission agreement of the legislative bodies in the member towns of that school district. That is set up that way, designed that way for very important reasons. Town, city, or village being able to decide on their own. They know the infrastructure that they have, i.e. the clerk and local election officials, and it's a defined body of voters, their voters on their checklist for that village, city, or town. Everybody tabulates their votes the same way because it's in a single village, city, or town. As soon as you start talking about mailing out ballots in any municipal entity that covers more than one town, you run into a lot of logistical questions and difficulties. And I can leave it there. We've got more time to talk about that as we go forward. Just to get your wheels turning a little bit, when I say that, imagine in a district that covers multiple towns, and there is one of the towns in that district that does their annual meetings from the floor. So it doesn't use Australian ballot at all for local elections. Then you have, if you empower a municipal district to unilaterally make a decision to mail ballots to all their voters, you're asking the clerk and other officials in that town to administer an entire early voting process. 20 days before the ballots need to be available. They need to be taking requests, mailing out ballots to voters on behalf of this municipal entity, and then standing up and conducting a polling place on whatever election day the municipality is targeting as its election. There needs to be just a lot of thought, and Carol, I'm sure has a lot to say about this subject in terms of this is a place where I'm really trying to protect the member clerks in those districts from essentially being asked to run a whole bunch of elections throughout the year, new right now, potentially under methods that they don't even use and have in place for their own local elections generally. And there's, at the same time, there's not the infrastructure, knowledge, human resources, money in the districts themselves to administer this. So, you could say, well, can't the clerks send their checklists to the district clerk of whatever municipality you might be talking about, the solid waste district or what have you, and then can they send out the ballots from there? That doesn't even touch on then what I was saying about tabulation. If you've got towns that hand count versus towns that tabulate, you're either telling the tabulator towns that they have to organize a hand counting process or vice versa. There's a lot to think about before you expand it past single town districts in terms of local ballot mailings.
I was surprised to see the governor's comments and his signing to the effect, I think many of us, including me, I reported on universal vote by mail. We've talked about some of those logistical challenges in Gov.Ops last biennium. So I was surprised to see, in the context of our temporary extension of some of those authorities, the strong endorsement of moving to universal vote by mail, resolving some of those issues. That was a big surprise.
I mean, and I believe that, what do I know? I would hope.
Apparently a lot.
I would hope that any suggestion about that is still going to proceed on an opt-in basis as it is now. I should have been clear about that too, right? It's these boards can vote to do it if they want to. If it were ever mandated at the town level for local elections, you're talking about eliminating town meeting. I just hope people understand that.
We will tread lightly and have a very thoughtful conversation. Definitely not a first couple of weeks of the session bill to accomplish something like that. Carol, did you have any comment on on the idea of universal vote by mail in the towns, opt-in versus mandate?
Interestingly, I've been having a bit of a push-pull with my mayor just this morning via email because he was excited about the governor's language and I'm less so.
That was very diplomatic of you.
But I will, as an example, Berry City is one of 18 towns that are members of the Central Vermont Career Center School District, which was formed last year. And so we have to coordinate 18 different towns. All the ballots have to be commingled. So we have to bring them all to central location for tabulating. And if we were trying to coordinate universal mailing across those 18 towns, in addition to everything else, it would be not insurmountable, but it would be a steep mountain to climb.
Thank you very much for that very clear example of why we need to think carefully about expanding the universal vote by mail beyond the general election. So I've kept you all 2 hours solid. I know there's a lot more that we probably will want to discuss, and I think we will probably try to connect with some experts on national elections to do a little bit more info and learning about that in the next week or so. I hope to have language on a few of these items that we talked about to acknowledge Tim Devlin from Legislative Council, who's been furiously taking notes, I think, over there as we think through this, who will be helping us with our work on elections policy. Will in the Secretary of State's office, you've been very generous with your time this morning. And Carol, very, very much appreciate you. I know you have a big job and town meeting days on the way. So again, my thanks, and thanks to the committee for barreling through for a couple hours straight. So I think we'll break for today, and we will be back this afternoon. We're going to hear a presentation from the Executive Director of Racial Equity at 1:00. And then before we go to the floor, I've been asked by a couple of members of the committee to have a committee discussion about some of the National Guard policies and priorities and requests that we've had from them. So we'll have a little committee discussion after the director